This is the Alaska Highway, 1,387 miles of pavement running from Dawson Creek in northern British Columbia all the way to Delta Junction through some of the most remote wilderness on the continent. Most people who know it think of it as a road trip, a legendary one. What most people don't know is that this road was built in 8 months during wartime, through terrain that made every single mile a problem that had to be solved from scratch. This is the story of how it happened and why. To understand why this road exists, you have to go back to December 1941 and understand something that gets glossed over in most history classes. Alaska was genuinely in danger of being invaded. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, most of the American public's fear focused on Hawaii and the Pacific Fleet. But military planners in Washington had a different problem. Alaska was American territory, and Alaska was completely exposed, separated from the continental United States by over 1,000 miles of Canadian wilderness with no overland connection at all. The only way to supply or reinforce it was by ship or by air, and both of those options were vulnerable. That concern became very concrete very quickly. In June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces bombed Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands, the island chain that stretches from mainland Alaska toward Japan. And then a few days later, Japanese troops landed on and occupied 2 islands further down that chain, Attu and Kiska. Those 2 islands became the only pieces of American soil occupied by a foreign military power since the War of 1812. This wasn't a distant threat anymore. Japan had a foothold on American territory, and the concern wasn't just symbolic. Military strategists genuinely feared that the Aleutians could serve as a stepping stone toward the North American mainland. Whether that fear was justified in hindsight doesn't really matter. At the time, it was taken seriously by the people responsible for defending the country, and it drove every decision that followed. President Roosevelt had already authorized construction of a highway to Alaska. The question wasn't whether the road would be built. The question was how. The proposed route ran almost entirely through Canada, which meant the United States needed a formal diplomatic agreement before a single bulldozer moved. That agreement came together relatively quickly. Canada was a wartime ally, and the strategic logic was obvious to everyone involved. The terms were straightforward. The U.S. would pay for all construction costs. Canada would provide the right-of-way and waive import duties, income taxes, and immigration restrictions for workers crossing the border. And after the war ended, Canada would receive full ownership of every mile of highway built on its soil. The United States agreed to those terms before anyone had fully reckoned with what they were actually agreeing to build. The route the engineers were looking at stretched through roughly 1,700 miles of terrain that presented one serious problem after another. Large sections of the ground were permafrost, soil that stays frozen year-round, sometimes to depths of hundreds of feet. Building on permafrost is not the same as building on ordinary frozen ground. When you remove the insulating layer of vegetation and moss sitting on top, the frozen soil beneath begins to thaw. When it thaws, it doesn't become stable ground. It becomes a kind of waterlogged slurry that has no load-bearing capacity at all, and it will swallow heavy equipment in the same way that soft mud swallows anything you try to park on it. In between the permafrost sections, there was muskeg, saturated peat bog that behaves similarly, except it's soft year-round. Muskeg is the kind of terrain where a bulldozer can sink to its cab and not be recovered. The engineers knew about both of these conditions, but knowing about them and having practical solutions ready to deploy at scale across hundreds of miles were 2 very different things. Beyond the soil, there were mountain ranges, steep grades, hundreds of river crossings, without a single existing bridge and weather that swung between -40-degree winters and summer mosquito swarms dense enough to clog engine air filters. There were no supply lines into the region. Everything, equipment, fuel, food, personnel, would have to be moved in from outside, often by air, to a project spread across a 1,000-mile front. The Army Corps of Engineers deployed 7 regiments, over 11,000 soldiers, alongside approximately 16,000 civilian contractors. In July alone, the crews built 400 miles of highway. When you actually stand in the Yukon bush and look at what the terrain is like, that number is almost difficult to believe. On September 24, 1942, soldiers from two regiments that had been pushing toward each other, one from the south, one from the north, met at Contact Creek. 8 months and 12 days after breaking ground, the Alaska Highway existed as a continuous passable route from the continental United States to Alaska. It was rough, it was steep in places, and it wouldn't be fully improved for years, but it was there. 4 of the 7 Army regiments that built the Alaska Highway were made up of African American soldiers, men serving in a military that was still formally segregated, under a policy that placed black units under white officers and systematically assigned them the most difficult assignments with the worst equipment. On the Alaska Highway, that meant the black regiments were given the highest mountain passes and the worst muskeg sections to work through. They were told, in some cases explicitly by their own military leadership, that they weren't capable of the work being asked of them. Some military officials questioned on record whether black soldiers could handle the extreme conditions or operate the heavy equipment. Their contribution was largely erased from the public record for decades afterward. The photographs that circulated during the war tended to feature white regiments. The newsreel coverage, the magazine features, the official military histories, all of it reflected a version of events that minimized what 4 of the 7 regiments actually did out there. It took historians years to reconstruct the fuller picture, and it still isn't as widely known as it should be. Roughly 30 men died during construction, a number that is genuinely low given the conditions, the pace, and the scale of the work. Nearly half of those deaths came from a single disaster. At Charlie Lake in northern British Columbia, a pontoon ferry carrying men and equipment across the water capsized in icy conditions. 12 soldiers drowned. The water was cold enough and deep enough that recovery was extraordinarily difficult. The last body wasn't recovered until 2 weeks after the accident. Outside of that one event, the construction losses came from the expected hazards of the work. Equipment accidents, hypothermia, frostbite that became fatal, and men swept away in river crossings. The highway that opened in November 1942 was not, by any definition, a finished road. It was a pioneer track, a route that connected 2 ends of the continent through wilderness that had previously been impassable by land, but a rough one that required serious work before it was fully functional. The grades were extreme in places. The bridges were temporary structures built for wartime urgency, not long-term use. The surface was unpaved, and in the spring thaw, it was nearly impassable as the frozen ground softened and the road turned to mud. The Public Roads Administration took over from the Army Corps of Engineers and spent the following years improving bridges, flattening grades, rerouting the worst sections, and bringing the highway up to something that could genuinely function as a permanent transportation corridor. During the war itself, access was tightly restricted. Anyone who wanted to drive the highway had to demonstrate to the Army that they had legitimate business in Alaska and obtain a formal permit. Unauthorized civilian travel simply wasn't allowed. For most of the war, the Alaska Highway was a military road. That changed gradually after the war ended. In 1946, the highway was open to homesteaders, people making the move into the Yukon or Alaska to settle land, before full public access was granted. In 1948, it officially opened to the general public, with Greyhound tour buses running some of the first paying passenger trips north. Even then, calling it open to the public was generous. The road was still unpaved, still demanding, and still required serious preparation. Canada formally took ownership of the Canadian portion in April 1946, as the original wartime agreement had specified. The United States had spent approximately $185 million building nearly 2,000 kilometers of road on Canadian soil, and then transferred it to Canada without compensation. It remains one of the more unusual infrastructure arrangements in the history of the two countries, though it made sense in the context of how the deal had been structured from the beginning. There is a part of this story that gets left out of most tellings, and it deserves a direct account. The Alaska Highway cuts through the traditional territories of numerous indigenous peoples, whose connection to this landscape goes back thousands of years. These communities had organized their entire way of life around the land the highway crossed. When thousands of workers arrived in 1942, they brought diseases that the indigenous communities along the route had no immunity to. Influenza, measles, and other illnesses spread rapidly through populations that had had little or no previous exposure. Some communities lost significant portions of their population in months. The workers came and went, the communities stayed and dealt with the consequences. This part of the story doesn't make the engineering less impressive, but it is inseparable from an honest account of what the construction of the Alaska Highway actually meant for everyone it affected, not just the people who planned and built it. Today, the Alaska Highway is fully paved along its entire length. The realignments and straightening projects carried out over the decades have shortened it considerably. The 1,700 miles of the original 1942 Pioneer Road has been reduced to 1,387 miles, as more direct routes replace the improvised bends and workarounds of the wartime construction. It carries commercial freight, supports the forestry, oil and mining industries across the Yukon and northern British Columbia, and draws tens of thousands of travelers each year who make the drive specifically for what the road represents. For a prepared driver in summer conditions, it is not particularly dangerous. The major hazards are the ones you'd expect from a remote highway and wilderness. Wildlife crossings, moose, bears, and caribou are a serious collision risk at any speed, and gas stations that can still be separated by distances that will strand you if you're not paying attention. In winter, the highway returns to something much closer to its original character: ice, reduced visibility, temperatures that test vehicles and the people in them, and emergency services that may be very far away. It is not a road that punishes the prepared, but it absolutely punishes the unprepared, and in winter, that distinction matters in serious ways. The Yukon's modern economy has the Alaska Highway somewhere in its foundation. The towns that grew up along it, the industries that built supply chains around it, the tourism that came decades later. None of that happens without the road. Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.